What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. Beyond UX Design shop is open. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop to pick up some big, beautiful art prints of some of my favorite UX and software related quotes. Pick up your copy of Beyond UX Design, Master Your Craft Beyond Pixels and Prototypes. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop and get your print on. This week's episode is brought to you by Wix Studio. If you're thinking about redoing your portfolio or kicking off a new website project, listen up. I only have 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things that you can do from start to finish in 30 seconds or less on Studio. You can adapt your designs for every device with responsive AI. You can jump seamlessly between front end and back end. Speed up projects with AI Code Assistant. You can start a new design library, reuse full stack apps and UI components across multiple sites. So time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/Wix to start creating today. This week's episode is brought to you by Backlog, a community of designers building their businesses together. If you've been dreaming of escaping the 9-to-5 and building your own business, Backlog is the community for you. Backlog brings together hungry designers turned entrepreneurs, all working to grow their freelance gigs, content, digital products, and design agencies. Join a network of like-minded folks sharing tactics, strategies, and systems to help you succeed. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/backlog and become part of a community that's building their businesses together. Don't wait. Find your path to independence with Backlog. And if you haven't done already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are a regular here, you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, and Marty for all their support. For more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing here, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. So if you've ever spent any amount of time on social media, you've no doubt seen all the amazing, beautiful things that people are creating with prototyping tools like Figma. Now, these high-fidelity designs are indeed beautiful, and new features like AI integration make it easy to pump out high-fidelity app designs in no time at all. But at what cost? Are we falling for the high-fidelity trap? I have got my guest on today. I'm really excited to chat with Pavel Samsonov, and he's going to tell us all about why we might be falling for the high-fidelity trap. And it might be doing high-fidelity maybe a little bit too early. So we're going to talk all about that today, and I'm really excited. Pavel Samsonov is a New York-based UX leader exploring the applications of design as a decision-making framework for all areas of product development. He currently builds design practice and leads innovation engagements at AWS. His approach to product and design draws on his experience managing enterprise product teams at Bloomberg, design-driven rapid prototyping in the startup world, traditional graphic design education, and an academic background in human-computer interaction. So Pavel, welcome to Beyond UX Design, man. I am so excited to have you on. How's it going?
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I am doing great.
Pavel, thanks so much. I know I read that bio a minute ago, but tell us about you.
Thanks, Jeremy, for introducing me. A little bit about my own practice right now as opposed to where I come from. It's kind of an interesting combination of design and stakeholder management and product management. So currently I work at AWS with AWS customers. So the customers of the platform trying to improve their own digital products. People usually come to AWS and they say, I'm going to migrate my workloads to the cloud. And we help them figure out, well, while you're re-architecting your entire system, how about you build something new? This is the perfect opportunity to improve the way you do things. So a lot of what I do is kind of like an agency model where we're able to help the customer understand what their problem is, what they're struggling with, what their customers are struggling with, and do something about it. The timelines are very different than a lot of conventional design projects. It's much more abbreviated. They sometimes have their own teams to work on it. Sometimes professional services will help us. But it's a very interesting challenge where you really get into a lot of these issues that we've talked about around not only how do we produce outputs as designers, but what does that full end-to-end flow look like of design contributing value to the process? There's a very common perspective that design is that thing you do that takes up time. If we do less design, we will get to our outputs faster. And that's true, except your outputs will need to be redone multiple times. That's really a big part of my job, is just explaining that to people, that you can redo the work lots and lots of times to get to where you want to be, or you can be wrong very early on through low fidelity. You can be wrong as many times as you want because it only takes you, $0 and a day or two to figure out that you were wrong. So that's I'm professionally wrong, essentially. That's my job.
I love it, dude. Awesome. Well, Pavel, I'm excited to have you on today and talk about all this. We're going to talk all about the high fidelity trap today. So just getting into it, man, what is wrong with high fidelity?
This is a theme that is near and dear to my heart. As you just covered, the backgrounds that I have, that I bring to my design practice are, there's a lot of different ways of approaching how we address different problems. And what I've found in my experience working with other designers who have more of a, I don't want to say focused background, but they're more of a conventional background, let's say, is that there's a one size fits all kind of approach. There's a common wisdom of, you can start by talking to users, or you start by talking to stakeholders, but universally the goal seems to be set as your job is to produce mockups. And once you have the mockups, you send them to the person that will talk to the developers. They get those mockups implemented, and then you have a website, and that's it. That's the job. Obviously, this is perhaps an oversimplification, but this is the emphasis on kind of high fidelity mockup as the benefit that design brings to the table is something that I encounter over and over and over and over again. And there's different justifications for why you need these high fidelity mockups. Some people say, oh, my stakeholders don't give me good feedback unless I give them high fidelity mockups. Some people say this is the best way to explore what they call the art of the possible. And unless you show people this kind of perfect, polished version of what could be, they're somehow not going to be able to respond to it in the appropriate way. And I think that the people who are so obsessed with doing the high fidelity mockups, they're only really doing half of their job, because there is value in high fidelity mockups. When I say mockups, I don't just mean static, files, PNGs in whatever program you prefer. I think that any high fidelity artifact, prototypes, whether in something like Figma or in code, kind of fall into the same bucket, where there's a focus on, as long as I can get this output, then I'm done, or then I've made some kind of impact. And I think it's half the job, because a high fidelity artifact is an external facing document. The reason you need to go to such a high degree of fidelity is because you are presenting this document to an audience that doesn't have your context, doesn't have the understanding that comes with the problem space. So it's the perfect type of artifact to demo to a executive stakeholder or to do user testing with. But for most of the problems that you want your artifacts to be solving day to day, high fidelity is not only unnecessary, but it's actually detrimental, because you're going to be working day to day with people who already have the same context as you, people who share a mental model of what the problem is, what the goals are, people that hypothetically have as much input as you do into the definition of the solution. And so when you're talking to your product manager or you're talking to the development team, high fidelity it shouldn't be necessary if you're doing your process correctly. If you're first aligning with that team on what the right thing to do is, and only then actually working towards that outcome. If you're doing the opposite way, if you're trying to first work towards a certain design and then convince everyone that this is the right thing to do, well, you're going to end up redoing a lot of that work, and you're going to be wasting a lot more time than you're saving by working directly in high fidelity with a tool like Figma.
And that's something too, I feel like a lot of people, you mentioned this, the value that a designer brings is the pretty pictures, right? That's why they hire us in the first place. And I guess this is true in some cases, but I think often that is not why we're hired. I want to talk a little bit about, from your perspective, this idea. You just talked a lot about some of the problems, and I'm curious, one of the things that I'm really interested in kind of digging into with you is how do you maybe even turn that conversation around? Because a lot of times there is that, expectation that you're going to just deliver something, pretty pictures, and why not start with the pretty pictures if I have a design system or I have the prototypes ready or I have templates I can just pull from? How do you flip that around so that that isn't the expectation?
The starting point for that conversation, I think, is trying to frame the value of design and what the organization you work in expects design to be able to do. If the starting point, and like you say, I think it's often the starting point that design is the thing that makes pictures, you're not really delivering any kind of value. And I think the conversation around, the ROI of design is the right conversation to have in a situation where you're not delivering value, because all you're doing is taking someone's idea and turning it into pixels. For me, at least, what's worked is starting from the bottom up at establishing a different approach to how not just design works, but how everyone works. Just because your colleagues or your collaborators or your stakeholders might not know how the design process should operate doesn't mean that you can't kind of teach them a little bit or take them along on that journey. And all of that starts with the way that you accept requirements, because it's very common, and I've seen this happen, and I've had this happen to me. It's very common to have a stakeholder come and say, here's my idea. I want to see this as an app, as a high fidelity design, whether it's a feature or it's an entirely new product. This is something that I think actually happens in a lot of disciplines, because at work, at Amazon, we have to do a lot of kind of mandatory trainings. Due to where I am in the org, I have to do a lot of sales training. And the very first thing they teach in every single one of these trainings is, if your customer asks you about a technical solution, don't start the conversation there. Get them to back up and get them to think about, what problem are they trying to solve? What is the goal that they have? And the reason you need to start with that is because you need to be able to look at the artifact you've created and look at the problem and say, yes, this solves that problem. Or more commonly, no, it doesn't solve that problem.
Yeah, that's true. Like, start at the start. That's what I like to say all the time. I feel like when you start with the high fidelity and, the button's going to look like this and it's going to be on the right-hand side and, we need these 5 fields or whatever it is, you start in the middle, because you haven't understood, like, why do we need a button in the first place? Why do we need a form? Why do we need that feature? Why do we need that thing? And to me, that is going back to the start, starting at the start versus starting in the middle. And I think that's most conversations I think I've had with, at least in the beginning, with stakeholders and things like that, product managers, it often ends up being that. So a few minutes ago, you talked about some high-level problems with these high-fidelity prototypes. And I want to talk a little bit about this illusion of high fidelity. When you and I spoke, we had a great conversation a few weeks back, and I knew that, like, high fidelity kind of enacts a certain thing in your brain. You think about different cognitive biases and things like that, where we tend to look at things that are prettier and associate a higher quality to them and stuff. And it sort of triggers a thing in our brain, and it is really an illusion of higher quality. And I want to talk a little bit about that, the illusion of high fidelity. When you think about that, talk to me about that. What does that mean to you?
So there's a theme that I come back to over and over again in this conversation, and it's hard for me to credit this concept. I didn't come up with it. I thought Dorian Taylor came up with it. He said he's heard it from someone else. But it's this idea that the artifact is not the work, it's just the receipt. The important thing, and you'll hear this if you've ever done any kind of Scrum training, the user story is not the important thing. The important thing is the conversations you have on the way to defining the user story. So when you see that high fidelity artifact, you kind of assume, holy crap, they must have done a ton of thinking, a ton of research, really good decision making went into making sure this thing looks precisely the way that it looks and not any other way. It really can conceal the fact that no decision making was done, no thinking went into it, especially when, you've got tools like Figma Make Design now, where you can press a button, or you could press a button, I think, for about a couple of hours until they realized that it was just ripping off Apple, and they had to disable it. But you just press a button and boom, high fidelity just happened. It makes it look like all those decisions were made. And if you put this in front of someone, that's how they're going to approach it. They're going to look at it and they're going to think, oh, this must basically work. They're looking for high-level suggestions. And so they're going to give you suggestions around, like you said, move the button, add this text, remove this text. Very, very trivial kind of feedback. And it might not necessarily be the type of feedback that you want to get at that stage in your process. There's another concept. It's the 30% feedback versus the 90% feedback. When you're presenting a high fidelity design to someone and they have that level of confidence in the amount of time you put into it, one of the reasons people offer you that feedback is they think you've spent a lot of time on it, that you're done with that thinking. But if you give them something high level, something very, lower fidelity, they are more comfortable giving you more deep feedback, the really foundational feedback you're looking for, because it's clear that all of that is still in question. You're still having a conversation around what is the right way to approach the problem in the first place, or maybe what is even the right way of framing the problem to begin with. So it's kind of like when you show someone something that looks 30% done, they're going to give you 30% feedback. And when you show someone something that looks like it's 90% done, they're going to give you 90% feedback that's appropriate for that kind of stage. The other issue is that when you've got the high fidelity artifacts and you've got all that stuff, you've got all the stuff that comes with an app. There's a login and there's, a drop downs. You kind of have your username and your picture at the top right corner. You've got the logo in the left corner, and all of those things, they're not actually design decisions you're making. They're not part of the product or the feature you're working on. They kind of don't even matter, because you've put them up in front of the person you're talking to. You've created a situation where they're actually distracting them from what you truly want to show them. And the lower fidelity you go, the more of that stuff you can get rid of, which is why I really like scenario storyboarding as a low fidelity tool. There's nowhere for ambiguity to hide in a scenario storyboard like that, because there's not very much on the page. You're walking through a scenario where there's context. You're listing out all your assumptions around where the user is and what they know and what they have. And then you're walking through how they get from that state to the problem solved state. Sure, it's a happy path. You're not going to put in necessarily things like error dialogues, but you're able to articulate the kind of golden thread from here's where you are to here's where you need to be. And that for me is really effective at defining the MVP that needs to be built, because you're creating that unbroken line that is a vertical slice of the experience. As soon as you're putting in all these other things, and I've experienced this tons and tons of times, you get stakeholders saying, hey, what about this feature? What about this feature? And you're transitioning from a vertical slice into the feature prioritization game. And then at the end, often what you end up with is a list of features that stakeholders liked best because they were super cool sounding, and you're missing a whole bunch of the basic boring stuff that you actually need to make them work, and you've delivered no value.
Thinking about, I don't know, this similar to scenario storyboarding, like you mentioned. One of my buddies, Dan Weiner, I don't know if you know him from LinkedIn, but I don't know if he came up with this or he found this somewhere, but he has this template that he shares. It's called a see-do map. And it's essentially similar to storyboard, but it's more like your information architecture. But it's essentially your app with just a bullet list of things you can see and things you can do. There's no mock-ups. It's just you can see these 5 elements on the page and you can do these 3 or 4 or 5 things. And then that links to then other pages where, I click a thing and it goes over here. I click a thing and edit a thing, delete a thing, CRUD, whatever. It takes all of the visuals out of it completely, and it really just gets you thinking only about the functionality on the screen without even being, confused about the layout. Is it on the left or the right, or what the labels are for the form fields or whatever? And that's another option. I really like that a lot, the one that Dan's got. And I've actually started using that with my stakeholders. And that was great because then they were able to really think about the problems and ignore the visuals altogether and really get them talking about much higher level issues and things versus, arguing about, what the form field should be.
I haven't seen that particular approach, but I've used something very similar when I do journey mapping. And I think journey mapping, honestly, is just like personas. It's a tool that has received a lot of flack because people don't know what it's for. And so they use it wrong. For me, it's exactly what you say. You have a stages of the experience, and at each stage you can say, here's what the user is seeing and here's what they're doing. And that is something that I like to combine with concepts out of Erica Hall's conversational design. And I think a lot of people really over-index on the conversational part to mean voice. Whereas coming from human-computer interaction, I like to think of any input as talking to the computer. And so you're having a conversation with your device. You can only really give it inputs in the way it's told you it can accept inputs. So it's kind of a recursive model in a way where you have something you want the computer to do. The computer is telling you, in order to do that thing, you need to tell me how to do it in this way. But then you have to be able to ask it to tell you that. And then it has to tell you how to ask it, how to tell you how to do the thing. Ultimately, you get to a point where it's something you already know how to do. And then we start having a conversation around what's intuitive and what isn't intuitive. Nothing is intuitive. Everything is learned. So figuring out where your user is at and then trying to find, the match is the way to do design. I run into this so much in the enterprise space. And anyone who's worked with, Workday and Salesforce and all those systems has experienced this, where there's something that you're supposed to do to solve the problem. There's usually a widget that someone's created or it comes with the software, and it's there, and you cannot find it for the life of you. Somewhere out there, there's a designer with a really cool user story or a really cool diagram that just says, well, when people have this problem, they simply go to this page and click these buttons. How do you know that you need to go to this page and click on those buttons? And the answer is most people don't. Most people are going to go in Slack and they're going to Slack their favorite colleague and they're going to ask them, can you please help me do this? And they're going to do that until they find someone with a link.
Everybody complains about Workday for job application. If you've never used Workday for entering your priorities every year and for the HR functionality, once you actually get the job, if all you know about Workday is application process, there is a whole nother side of Workday that is even worse than you could possibly imagine. And yeah, that one, SAP is another one too, where there's just a million buttons and icons and you have no idea what anything means. And it's funny because like you said, somewhere somebody's got a very simple diagram that says click this button and do the thing. And the whole question discoverability. I think this is again going back to this idea of low fidelity. When you get out of that high fidelity screen, you can start to talk at those high levels. Like, how does somebody even get here? How do they even know this functionality exists? And I think a lot of designers don't ever ask that question. They're laser focused on the immediate macro thing or the micro thing that they have to do. I need to put this feature together, but where does it exist in the larger scheme of things? And when you focus, I think, jump right into the solutioning, like you said, you kind of miss that stuff, which is something I want to talk about next, because let's say you do that and you have that nice little process maps as user clicks a thing, you release it into the world, come to find out no one uses that feature because they couldn't get there. What ends up happening is you end up with missed expectations and you lose trust with your stakeholders because they assumed you solved the problem. And when it didn't perform as well as everyone had expected, they generally, oftentimes, come back and blame the designer or the product team, essentially. And I want to talk a little about that from your perspective. This problem with this focus on high fidelity at a deeper level, you mentioned it's sort of this illusion, but beyond that, I feel like it's the missed expectations. It's the non-aligned expectations, which ultimately leads to a decrease in trust and confidence, which ultimately goes back it's interesting thinking about that. The ROI of design conversation, you're then forced to sort of justify your value because you didn't deliver.
I mean, that's honestly something that gives me a lot of confidence in the fact that Figma make design will never replace a real designer. Because when a stakeholder comes to me and tells me to go do something stupid, I'm going to say, I'm not doing that. When a stakeholder comes to me and asks me to do something that is ill-defined, which happens probably a lot more often than the first one, I can ask a ton of follow-up questions that helps me understand not only what they're asking me to do, but what they actually mean. And a lot of the time, that's when I tell them I'm not doing that because that's stupid or it's unethical or it's going to lose us a lot of money. The AI can't do that. The AI receives a prompt and it gives an output. If your prompt is vague, your output's going to be, something. But because of its high fidelity, I don't know what you're going to get. Because it's high fidelity, it's going to look right. It's going to look exactly like a designer's output would. And because you don't have the conceptual fidelity to understand that it's a bad output, it looks fine. Look at that. All the buttons are there. They look just like the buttons the rest of our website has. I'm going to send this to the developers. The best case scenario is that the developers call you up on the phone and yell at you. The worst case scenario is they first try to build it and then they yell at you because they're going to yell at you either way. This is kind of the goalie problem that a lot of the time designers are the ones who have to say, this is not going to work. This is not going to give us the outcome that we want. But if you don't have design doing that function, the developers are the ones that are going to have to do that because you can push ambiguity back and back and back and back, but there will come a time when someone has to replace lorem ipsum with real content. And you don't want developers to be writing your content because then it's going to get to the user and then it's going to fail. You want it to fail as early as possible to avoid incurring waste. And to me, this is the biggest issue with not just the drive towards high fidelity, but the entire kind of build, measure, learn loop to begin with is if you're only measuring after you've built, that's a tremendous amount of waste. If you're only evaluating the fitness of your design work after you've done high fidelity, that's a tremendous amount of waste. There are many quicker and easier ways to find out that what you're doing is not going to work. And you can do that within the span of minutes or hours without having to go through days and iterations of these designs or weeks or months of writing code. And to take that back to the expectation setting, I think that stakeholders are expecting you to stand up for the outcomes. They're expecting to have hired or expecting someone else to have hired a professional who can tell them that they're on the wrong track. And one of the things that stakeholders, I think, assume is that they're on the right track and you'll tell them if they're not. You'll still get pushback because they're convinced they're on the right track, but they don't really know what kind of input you're looking for as a design professional if they don't work with design professionals normally. They're going to give you suggestions like, oh yeah, it's going to need a button, it's going to need this, it's going to need that, because that's what they think design wants as inputs. And you need to be the one, pull them out of that low-level conversation and start talking about what are you actually trying to get out of this? What is your understanding of this opportunity? And that's really when you find out that they don't really have a hypothesis. They just saw something on Instagram or on Facebook or on Amazon.com or on TikTok, and it was a cool feature, and they thought we should have this too. There's no real theory for how doing that will translate into outcomes. And they'll go to you and they'll say, hey, can we make this like this other app I saw? And if you don't push back on that, they're going to assume that their idea is valid in the same way that you, quote unquote, validate your work with user testing. They validate their work by sharing it with people inside the company. And if you just pick it up and roll with it, they're going to assume it was a perfectly fine idea. Yeah, after you build it and it doesn't work, they're going to assume that the problem is your implementation of their idea. Because until now, they've had no indication that the idea is bad. It's very difficult, I think, to get them to understand their idea is bad, but you need to do that. And being able to do that with the minimum of waste is the skill that designers need to learn. If designers know how to do that, and I think the way to do that is you can't teach someone in other ways by telling them this is a bad idea, this is how you should do design. You can't train someone to be a designer when they're trying to get you to do work. You can try to walk them through your thought process to get them to figure out on their own that their idea doesn't make any sense. There's a quote, I think it's from Voltaire or someone, one of the old people, that goes something like, You cannot convince someone to change their opinion through reason if they didn't obtain the opinion through reason.
I've never heard that quote. I love that quote.
That's actually something that is really useful for us. Because if you just tell someone they're wrong, they're going to push back on you because, hey, it's my opinion versus your opinion. If you try to help them connect the facts on the ground to the opinion they formed, I think it's very easy comparatively to get them to figure out, oh, hang on, that actually doesn't fit. We can't draw a straight path from where we want to be through this course of action. Because they didn't think of any of that stuff. They just saw something, a cool feature, and they saw a cool feature in another app, and they want to build that feature in their app. They're assuming that this other app's designers must have been really smart, and Amazon makes a lot of money, and so therefore every single feature on Amazon is responsible for making some of that money. And it's kind of like that old saying about advertising: 50% of your ad spend is wasted. You just don't know which 50% it is. And it's kind of like that. Not every single feature is a moneymaker. Not every single feature is a good idea. And also, Amazon has very different problems than you do. And I'm comfortable saying that regardless of who's in the audience listening to this, because there is no other company like Amazon. The problems that we have are very unique. A lot of them are self-created. You're probably struggling with something completely different from what we're doing. To put a bow on that, you need to get people to start reasoning from this starting point of what is the goal we're trying to achieve and how is this thing going to get us there. There's another bugbear that I constantly have where people will say, oh, this will make it easier, or this will make it more delightful. And then I get into this other conversation around, well, what's making it hard today? Rather than saying it's going to make it easier or it's going to make it better, let's talk about specifics. Is there a specific friction point that you're going to eliminate? Is there a specific confusing input that you've had a very high level of error rates on that you're going to get rid of? Is there a difficulty converting customers that a little bit of delight will improve? Or is there, a disappointing stage, an error where, like Duolingo, for example, people try to copy Duolingo all the time. The little owl that comes up and it looks sad and it says, you failed the exercise. I'm so sorry. Like, that's going to make me feel a little bit better. If that owl comes up on my health insurance input and says, sorry, your treatment is rejected, I'm going to be extremely mad.
Right.
But it's the same owl, is the same feature.
Cute little illustration. Yeah.
Exactly. This is Scalzi. He has a quote: "The failure mode of clever is asshole." And I think a lot of delight, quote unquote, that designers try to put in because they saw it somewhere else is asshole. You're doing asshole design because it doesn't fit with the experience you're trying to have. It doesn't actually provide any kind of benefit. And so that's where you need to start with stakeholders. You need to, regardless of where they want to start, you, as a design expert, are the one responsible for bringing them to start from the beginning and not, as you say, from the middle. Otherwise, you can blame them. You can say they don't listen, but they don't know design. You know design. If you're just going to say they're telling me to do the wrong thing without helping them tell you how to do a better thing, then you're going to be junior forever. You're not going to get to the point where people will trust you with higher level decision making.
I love that. Yeah, something that I always tell my team, something that I think a lot of designers fail at, just like you said, you're never going to convince someone that they're wrong if they didn't come to that opinion through reason. You can't reason with someone who's unreasonable. And so the thing that I really think works well, and you mentioned this, and I think this is just worth highlighting again, is asking those questions, showing them data if you have some, and getting them to come to the conclusion themselves and making them think it was their idea from the beginning. Without, you don't get credit for it. You're not going to say, I changed their mind. Let them think it was their idea. And at the end of the day, the result is that, there's net better software and the users are better off. It doesn't matter who came up with the idea, but, asking those questions and letting them come to those conclusions themselves, you're often going to win that battle more than you would just telling somebody that they're wrong, So that's something I think is really interesting. Something that you mentioned the last time we talked, and I think this is a really interesting thing. And I'll be honest, I hadn't considered this before. You called out the fact that a lot of junior designers coming out of school, they have this sort of power dynamic with their professors, and they default to authority. You have this sort of dynamic in school, obviously. When you get into the job market, though, you tend to carry that dynamic with you. And that mental model working with stakeholders is they're the authority figure. They're like my professors and they have all the answers. And often, as you said, they don't. And our job is to push back, but we often don't push back. And I want to talk a little bit about this as it relates to dealing with stakeholders, because that's just an interesting analogy. Your stakeholders are not your professors. And I want to talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind, and how you've seen that play out and maybe some ways that junior designers can avoid that, because I think that's something a lot of them don't even realize that they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. This is something that I've started realizing more and more, now that the years of school are further behind me, that it's really a very different dynamic and the way you work together is very, very different. When you're in design school, you have a professor and the professor tells you, here's what you're doing. You get an extremely detailed brief, very specific. They even tell you, here are the methods that you must do. You must do a persona, you must do a storyboard, you must do wireframe, you must do a slightly higher fidelity wireframe. And then you must do the entire app design, end to end, high fidelity, all the features that are necessary. And then you're done, you put it in your portfolio. And it's really easy to get used to that and kind of expect that that's the way it's going to work from now on. And when you talk to the professor, during your weekly critique, the professor looks at whatever artifact you're currently at, and the professor has a good sense of what that artifact should look like and what that gap is between what you have and what their idea of good is. And once you graduate, you're never going to work together with a professor ever again. If you're lucky, you're going to work with a very senior designer who might mentor you, but they're going to mentor you in a very different way from that professor. And I think that the expectation that any senior person will be that mentor is the undoing of many designers, especially those who are trying to build a design practice somewhere that doesn't really have a high degree of design maturity yet. If you join a team with only a handful of designers and maybe you don't even report into a design manager, you report into product. My first design job, I reported into the CTO, which makes no sense, but that's where I was. And trying to look to one of those stakeholders as though they were a professor who could tell you, do a persona, and then look at it and tell you if this is a good persona or this is a bad persona, that dynamic doesn't work anymore. You can't ask your stakeholders, what should I do next? They expect you to know what you should do next. They're looking to you to tell them, here is the next step in the design process. And they're not going to know what a good looks like. They are looking to you to determine what good enough looks like, because most likely you're not going to have the same amount of time you did in design school to do all of these projects. You need to work more quickly. You need to work with fewer resources. There is a much greater degree of ambiguity. You're never going to get a kind of very neat brief that tells you everything you need to know. There is hypothetically, a product requirements document that might exist. It's not going to look like a design project brief. And so when you go to stakeholders and you ask them, is this good? You are, in a way, putting them on the spot. You're signaling to them, can you be my design professor? And they're not only not qualified, they're not expecting it. And so they're going to be trying their best to give you the feedback you're signaling to them that you need. And that feedback is going to be awful because they're not qualified to give that feedback. So regardless of how you feel about your degree of experience, you need to flip the tables around. You need to be that teacher who shows the artifact to the stakeholder and expresses, here is why I created this. Here's why I'm showing this to you. Here is why it does the things that I think it needs to do. And if you don't have a sense of why you want to create an artifact, don't create it. You go out into the world, you never make another persona again. No one's going to call you out on it. There's no one who you work with who's going to say, hang on a minute, shouldn't there be a persona? Shouldn't there be a storyboard?
Where's your empathy map? Yeah.
Exactly. There's no checklist of requirements. There's only the goals that you need to achieve as a designer on a product team and whether or not you're achieving those goals. All of those artifacts, they serve to answer certain questions. And whether or not they answer the questions is what determines if it's a good artifact or not. If you can answer the question that you need to answer with an empathy map and you never use the empathy map, no one cares. And I think that's what really appeals to me about the lean model. Not necessarily the precise Toyota way, but just the attitude towards artifacts, which is that you should minimize the amount of artifacts you produce. Instead of trying to make something on paper and share it with someone, you should be working together with them to create a shared mental model so that when you create something, they're not surprised. You don't have to explain it. Or better yet, they create something and show it to you without you even needing to create any mock-ups or create any of these artifacts.
I used to work at GE Aerospace, and GE was big on lean and, the manufacturing space and all that stuff. And what they used to do, and I've always found this fascinating, and I compare this sort of to the high fidelity, low fidelity prototypes, is they would take, a conference room and they would map out the shop, the cell, for instance, and they would do it with, boxes. They wouldn't go and bother getting a machine and moving a machine around and getting it looking like it could set up and actually do some work. It was just a box that was the size of that table or tape on the floor. And they would just do that and mock it up and say, how many steps is it from this point to that point? And do I have to go back and forth, or can I move this table next to this other table because I'm doing these two machines in tandem? And they would mock that up. And to me, that's a perfect example of doing it in low fidelity before you spend any time going and doing it in high fidelity. And it's a model that, often we just, as designers, we just skip. And like you said, we jump right into it. It's just a waste of time. It ends up creating the wrong thing. When I go and I think about that idea of like putting it all on a cardboard in a conference room or something, you can get other people looking in and they see like, this is clearly a test. This is clearly a prototype. This is clearly just something we're playing around with. We're not done yet, and I think ultimately going back to this idea that we talked about, it's the trap of getting the 30% versus the 90% feedback. When you see it in box form, someone's going to come in and they're going to, the shop leader is going to give you that feedback. If it was already done and the wires were installed and all the infrastructure was set up and everything else, they're going to give you much different feedback about how you set it up, knowing that we might have to go back and rework a bunch of stuff. So anyway, I just love that idea. And I think the thinking through lean is a great way to think about this whole process of design in general, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that the cardboard prototyping example is a great example. I did a lot of that during my master's work for human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon. We were working on touch tables and expensive hardware, very difficult to get your hands on, for a student to set up, to start programming. We got some display board and some paper cutouts, and we started moving them around on that table, and we started lifting the table up and down to make sure it's the right height and things like that. And you can do a lot of testing. You can do a lot of testing. You can make a lot of decisions just by doing that. So whenever I hear, oh, we do build, measure, learn, I mentally think strike out build and replace it with try. Try doesn't have to be done. Try doesn't have to be in code. Try just means put it out there. Create something for your user to react to. It doesn't need to be usable. It doesn't need to function. It just needs to help you answer the questions that you have around what the design is. Yeah, if all of your questions are what color should the button be and where should the button be placed, a lot of that is only doable at a high fidelity level. If your question is, are we solving the right problem, which is a question very few designers ask, then you can get away with a storyboard. You can get away with just an interview to understand that you're actually solving the wrong problem. And you've saved yourself a ton of money and you've gained a ton of credibility when you're able to go back to your stakeholders and you say, I talked to 20 people and here are verbatim quotes from them telling you that this is not the right problem to solve, that the color of the button is not the biggest problem they have. The biggest problem they have is when they press the button, their computer catches fire.
And going back, just tying all of this together, right? Like that concept, it's sort of a flywheel, or even, I guess the opposite might be a death spiral, where you can deliver what they ask and it doesn't work. and you assume they know what they're doing and you're wrong and it fails, the next time they come back, they're not going to trust you. And so they're more likely to be more specific because they felt they couldn't trust you to deliver. So they're going to give you even more specific requirements and expect more specific feedback and maybe start micromanaging and things like that. But if you can deliver, it's more like a flywheel. Like if you do that, you build trust. The next time they might come back and give you more responsibility or be less prescriptive and include you in on that conversation earlier. So, and then you deliver, and then again more they build more and more trust that way. And I think going back to the beginning of that sort of idea that we talked about you have the missed expectations and non-aligned expectations and you lose the trust, it kind of like ties that all together, I think, and I think that really hits it home. I really love that.
Yeah, there's a really good parallel to what you describe as that death spiral in a lot of companies that work in a siloed way. And that parallel is Agile. Agile was initially created as an immune response to not to waterfall, but to what's called the rational unified process. And it was essentially a way to say that we do not bear any responsibility for the changes that keep coming down the line. The interesting thing about the original definition of Agile is it says customer, 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 customer. That customer is not the end user. That customer refers to the business. So what Agile is saying is we're going to create a framework within engineering so that when the business asks for stupid things, we can cover butts. And so what you get is a dynamic where you're only saying, we are responsible for the outputs, and the rest of that is your problem. And that works great for engineering because engineering can go and say, here's all the code we wrote this year. Here's the degree of stability we were able to achieve. Here's our sprint velocity. There's all these different metrics that have nothing to do with delivering value to the customer, which is to say the end user. Designers can't do that. Designers can't go and say, here's all the mockups we drew. Okay, you drew 500 mockups this year. So what? It doesn't matter. There's no value coming from that. There's no impact. You don't get to claim success as a designer until your customer's life has been improved in some way. So we can't say, well, we did the mock-up that you asked us to do and it didn't work out. What a shame. We did our part of the bargain. We have to own the actual impact that hopefully helps the business survive, but at least helps the customer accomplish some of their goals. Because there are a lot of products out there that help people do what they want to do, and the business model is not there. And eventually those products are going to go away because there's no money. But for now, we get to use them and we're happy about it. But if you're not even delivering that value, if you're only delivering mock-ups, then you're not actually providing any ROI. So we need to be able to stand up and say, you're asking me for outputs that don't have any impact. You're asking me to do pointless work.
Here's the question I think everybody listening up till now is probably curious about is when would be the right time for high fidelity then? Because it's interesting because I could even imagine in certain companies, you might never actually need high fidelity at all, right? I could imagine a place like Amazon. I've never worked there, but I imagine there's a pretty robust design system, component library and things of that nature, a lot of reusable components. So I could, in theory, draw something on a marker board, show an engineer. They could then take it and turn it into an actual working code, push it to production without ever actually needing to mock anything up in high fidelity. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what would be the right time for high fidelity?
So Jeremy, I think you're asking exactly the right question, which is, what do I want high fidelity to do for me? And if you're relying on high fidelity to make sure that the behaviors you intend to design are reproduced faithfully within the live code, you're using the wrong tool. I have done so much high fidelity work in my career, handed it off to the developers, and a couple of months later, I go to the website, it works nothing
Right, it doesn't
like
look
what I
anything.
asked them to do.
Yeah.
It doesn't look right. It doesn't work right. I find out retroactively that certain parts of the functionality were cut for scope. And there's still a Confluence wiki full of really awesome high fidelity work that I did, but I can't claim success because it didn't get implemented that way. So that to me is really an important question to ask. What am I using my high fidelity to achieve? Once you've answered that question, I think you've answered the other question, which is when do I want to go high fidelity? there's lots of different reasons that you might want to do a high fidelity artifact, a prototype or a mock-up or anything else. I think for portfolio work, yeah, if you want to put something in your portfolio, you're going to make it look really nice. And there's a certain amount of, I think, showmanship that people do where the artifact in the portfolio is not necessarily what's actually been implemented. And, there's different ethical questions around that. Other reasons you might want to use high fidelity design, if you're trying to articulate kind of, and I don't like this term, but the art of the possible, the high level vision of 5 years from now, here's where we could be. Before you start looking at what's the minimum viable scope, you need to look at where do we want to end up to make sure that you're not just hitting low-hanging fruit, you're actually paving the path on the way to that outcome. And high fidelity is useful for that because you're not really trying to implement that. You're not necessarily trying to recreate a design system from scratch. You're just creating that vision. And the best response that you want from stakeholders is, I love it, let's go build it. And then you get to have the conversation around, so what's the first right part of this to build?
And your question about, what does this tool do for me? I think is something we as designers should be asking about every one of the tools in our toolkit, whether that's high fidelity, low fidelity, personas, journey maps, empathy maps, whatever they are. It's funny, I'm just equating this again to, a boot camp portfolio where I have a checklist of activities that I did and look at all the things I did without ever thinking about why did I create a persona? How does this persona help me get to the next step? And I think if we asked ourselves that question about all the tools in our toolkit, we would be probably working a lot more effectively and a lot more efficiently than a lot of us are today. Crazy to think about, but we often don't ask that question.
Absolutely. Whenever I have this conversation and people defend high fidelity mockups and make fun of low fidelity tools, that's the question that I like to ask is, what are these tools doing for you? Because low fidelity tools, they don't do the same job as high fidelity. If I'm going to make a set of wireframes or sketches, I'm not going to expect it to accomplish the same thing as a full prototype. I see the low fidelity artifacts as opportunity definition artifacts where I can turn around and within half an hour or kind of minutes of a stakeholder giving me their idea or giving me their requirements, I can turn around and say, did I understand you correctly? Is this the problem framing? Is this how the solution will deliver the benefit that we need? Is this the benefit itself? Did I interpret you correctly? And a lot of the time they'll say no. And I just saved weeks of high fidelity work where they're going to say no anyway. Whereas hi-fi design, it's really about the delivery of the solution. Once we've defined what it's going to be, I need to do this high-fidelity work to show to the right people what it needs to look like. And some of that is going to be to developers, because developers do often need to know how are things going to be laid out. Are there any constraints around things like loading times or things like latency or things like autocomplete, where the technical component of the user experience is actually a big deal. For lots of things, it doesn't matter. I don't need a high fidelity prototype that shows here's the website because there's already a website. We're not changing how the website works. We might be changing a small part of it. But then I also don't need to show here's what the checkbox needs to look like because we have a checkbox component. I don't need to illustrate every single error code, for example. But my developers need to understand what happens if you run into an error like that. And that's where diagramming is super, super important. No amount of high fidelity screens are going to replace a really good flow diagram that tells the developers, here's what needs to happen, if this, then that. If you're familiar with the concept of a finite state machine, which is a very, very computer science kind of thing and not at all a design thing, it's actually a really cool and useful diagram. And that artifact is going to be far more valuable to your developers in a lot of cases than mockups that they could reproduce just by loading in the design system over top of some wireframes. And the other thing that I truly believe high fidelity design needs to happen for is content. Because people talk about form follows function. The function of a website is to read the content on the website and sometimes to post content to the website. Sometimes with things like LinkedIn, we don't read, we just write. But most of the time, you're going to have reading and then maybe some content manipulation or content submission. So you need to start with a high fidelity concept, then you need to have high fidelity content. And only then, if you still need it, do you create high fidelity visuals. A lot of the time, if you have high fidelity content, you don't need high fidelity visuals because the developers just plug that in and all your boxes resize and all your layout reflows in the way that the design system has been designed to scale the boxes and to reflow the layout. And if your design system doesn't do that automatically, well, then maybe that's a problem you should be solving first instead of trying to create by hand all of these things.
It's funny, we talked about Figma and Figma can create these beautiful, prototypes for you with a click of a button or a simple prompt. But we don't think often, I don't think a lot of us think about the implications of something like dev mode, where I make it really easy for my engineers to circumvent those components by grabbing the data or the attributes from a Figma file and just recreating it outside of the standard component. And so you end up with all these variations and things that aren't synced, and you end up with inconsistencies all across the tool because the developers went and grabbed the font size and plugged that in and created a static thing instead of using a variable or using a component that created another component, and it didn't match the original. And it's kind of interesting. It's like it makes it really easy, but then also too it introduces a lot of complications down the road if there's not a cohesive way that your teams are using all of these tools together. Which again, thinking about it, what does dev mode enable you to do? Or should you be using dev mode once you have a robust design system? Or should you be using the design system to build those things? Why is an engineer ever in dev mode looking at what the hex value is for a thing? They should be referencing the design system itself and not the Figma file anymore. So that thinking about those tools, Figma is again another tool. How are we using it, and why is it helping us? How is it helping us? So we've had you for a little while now. Before we get out of here, I like to ask questions to help my listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. But before we do that, anything else that we didn't get a chance to talk about today as it relates to the high fidelity trap that you think is worth calling out?
I think there's one thing I'd like to add, and I hear this a lot less nowadays than I used to, and I think it's due to the rise of Figma, but it used to be very, very popular to tell designers, oh, you should learn how to code. And I think in some parts of the world or some parts of the industry, you will still hear this. Hey, learn how to code, learn how to code. This goes back to a conversation around what do you want the tools to do for you? What do you want being able to code to do for you? A lot of the assumptions are around, I want to be able to turn my designs into interactive kind of prototypes. And a lot of that goes back to this same conversation where people want to do a really cool demo for their stakeholders. And so they want to be able to code up their own demo. One thing that I would like to bring up to push back on that a little bit is the demo the blocker that is the bottleneck for you being more productive than you are right now? If you're working with developers very closely, they're going to be better developers than you are.
Right. Yeah.
I've had a stretch during my career where I was doing product management and design and front end development at the same time. And so predictably, I was only really able to do that work kind of at 1/3 of the speed of what a dedicated developer was able to do, even when I put my full time into it. Your time is much better used aligning with someone who knows how to code as a job and then getting them to implement it than it is to focus on doing it yourself. I think there's a very unicorn kind of I want to do everything myself myth that exists, and it's the people we put on the pedestal are those who can do everything themselves. In real life, you have a team. You have people who you work with. It's going to be more difficult to get them to understand what you're talking about, but in the end, it's much more efficient to explain it to them. If you are going to learn how to code, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but if you are, a lot of people learn JavaScript. JavaScript's awful. What you should be doing is you should be learning the HTML and CSS box model.
Style the output that, yeah.
Yeah. Not even necessarily all of HTML and CSS, just the box model, so that you can put together a layout that reflows correctly and is dynamic. And you can give it to a developer and you can say, here is what this needs to do. Here is the structure. And then they can put in all the widgets that fetch backend code and things like that. They could do it much faster than you. The thing that you're contributing here is making sure that the website behaves like you envision the website should behave. And once you have that kind of division of labor, things are going to move much faster because it's very difficult to articulate on paper how a layout actually needs to reflow compared to just showing it. And then what that lets you do, you've got your layout, you've got your content, you're pretty much all the way there. All they need to do is connect it to the backend. So learning to code is advice that you will often hear. It is useful in some cases, but it all goes back to start with what you're trying to achieve and only then pick the tool that is the best way for you to get there, rather than picking the tool first, in this case, learning to code or creating high fidelity prototypes, and only then trying to figure out, oh crap, what am I going to do with this skill now that I have it, or trying to solve every problem with that one skill.
Yeah, and it's crazy. Figma hasn't, all the crazy stuff they're building, they haven't built something as simple as like resizing designs based on breakpoints. And having something like that built into Figma, designing responsive layouts without having to build 3 different artboards with the layout and actually having that function. It's crazy, all that time spent on like AI stuff, and it's not even, you can't even use it because they turned it off. When something as simple as, maybe it's not that simple, but something as straightforward as being able to resize a layout, similar to, I guess, like Framer can do something like that. But anyway, I love that idea, to your point. So, Pavel, this has been really great chatting with you today. I think this is a really great conversation. I think it's a very important conversation for a lot of, especially junior designers who, see these fancy, sexy prototypes all the time. Figma promotes this, I think, and they have, a business incentive to promote this, right or wrong, whatever. But I think it's something a lot of designers fall for. So I'm really excited to have you on today to talk about it. So before we get out of here, I have got 5 questions I like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. First one up, what is your favorite non-design book?
So that is a very difficult question for me to answer.
You seem very well read. I'm assuming you've read a lot of books.
Voracious reader.
Yeah.
I actually think that a lot of the books we read are too focused on the practical outcomes, the things that are, I'm going to read a book that tells me how to do Scrum, and then I'm going to be better at doing Scrum. And a lot of designers will tell you, I read some psychology or anthropology books. And what I'm going to say is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin is a fantastic book, has nothing to do with any of that stuff. It is utopian science fiction, and it envisions a different world. And that, I think, is a really useful tool for getting you to think about all the things you already know in a different light. It's a concept called cognitive estrangement, where you take all the stuff you already know about and you set it in an unfamiliar setting. You're coming across all these things you're used to, but because of the light they're painted in, you're able to reevaluate them completely fresh. Because the context you're used to seeing them, like I'm walking down the street and there's a vending machine and they buy a bottle of water. Whereas I'm walking down the street on Mars and there's a vending machine and they buy a bottle of air on Mars. And suddenly people are like, air? What? But that's, that comes for free out of the atmosphere. And it's like, well, not on Mars, it doesn't. And so is it fair to charge someone for air to breathe so they can survive? And then you start wondering, well, is the case with that bottle of water? So I think in terms of books, utopian science fiction in general, The Dispossessed specifically, it's a great book. A lot of other books from the same era, the Xenogenesis trilogy, very similar as well. It's a bit of a dense read, but it's worth it.
No, I totally agree. I think those other books have their place to learn methods and things like that. But I think you can get so much more from a, philosophical level from those other books, other concepts, other mediums that are completely unrelated to design or software, and I think will make you a better overall designer, person, friend, family, colleague, all that stuff by engaging in that kind of stuff. So I love that you mentioned that. What is your favorite non-design podcast?
So that's a difficult question to answer for another reason, which is I don't really do a lot of podcast listening.
Okay.
I'm much more of a reader, much more of a visual person. Oftentimes, I'm listening to something and then I have to catch myself and think, hang on, I kind of zoned out there for a second. I wasn't really paying attention to what was happening. So unfortunately for podcasts, I can't give you anything there.
No, it's all good. What is your favorite meal? I assume you eat in New York. You probably have lots of options.
I actually love to cook. It's one of the things I mean, I guess if you took down, if you, I guess if you like measured hour by hour, what do I do most of? And other than work and sleep, I think probably cooking
Yeah.
meals is, it takes some time. Like, it's going to take an hour after work, half an hour during the day to fix some lunch and some dinner. So I like to, experiment with lots of different things. But then when push comes to shove and I'm like, I just want something that's comforting and it's got all the different flavors. If you know the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat,
Yeah.
or the Netflix show, I mean, those are basically all the things you need. And so I like to do a toasted sourdough bread, some wasabi pickles, some cheese, and then like a little cured ham. And I don't know if that counts as a meal.
I'll allow it.
Yeah, it's kind of my go-to when I'm not craving anything in particular.
I love it, dude. That's really cool. All right, what is your favorite vacation spot?
Vacation spot. I think Spain and Portugal, which is also a bit of a cheat because it's two different countries, but
close.
very similar climate, obviously closely connected history with the Muslim influence coming up from the south, and of course the colonial history bringing in all kinds of foods, all kinds of flavors, all kinds of cultural artifacts as well. I've been lots of times. One of my favorite things is the train system there. You fly into one city, you can be in another city in a couple of hours, and you're not wasting time at the airport. You show up to the train like 5 minutes before it's leaving. You hop on, and because you don't need to go through security, you've got your bottle of wine, you got your Iberian ham, you've got your bread, you've got your whole picnic spread there, and you roll it out and you watch the olive trees go by.
That's awesome. Now you're making me jealous, man. You're making me jealous. I need to do that. I've actually never been to Europe for fun. I've only ever been for work. And so I need to get over to Europe and actually have fun in Europe for some time instead of just going over there to do some work. But I love that, man.
One of the nice things about being in New York is that the flights to Europe are pretty fast and relatively cheap.
Yeah.
I've been able to go to Portugal for like $300
oh
or
my God. Good
something
Lord.
like London or Paris. And on the other hand, what are my options going the other way through the US? You can't go anywhere. There's not much. Compared to the West Coast. So you can go to Hawaii, you can go to, LA, you can go to Seattle, you can go to Denver, lots of different options. So it's not necessarily better, but you just get a different grab bag.
Yeah, well, you can make your way over to Cincinnati, can hang out. So don't overlook Cincinnati, man. It's Queen City. The Paris of the Midwest, as they say. All right. What is your favorite? I'm joking, by the way. Well, actually, it's a pretty nice town if you ever want to come. What is your favorite design tool that is not Figma? You probably have a bunch, I'm sure. Figma might not even be your favorite.
So I joke a lot that Figma is not a design tool. Figma is a documentation tool.
I saw you post this the other day.
Yeah. To me, a design tool is the thing that helps them make design decisions. I like Miro.
Yeah, I love
it
Miro.
captures all the best parts of what's called distributed cognition, where you put part of your brain out into space with sticky notes. And, that's a benefit to the sticky notes. That's not a benefit to Miro. But Miro models it well. It's easy to find what you were doing beforehand, and it's easy to kind of search it, pick up where you left off, edit things. You don't have to have something up on the walls of your house, and then one day you look and one of the sticky notes fell off and you forget where to put it.
Right. Yeah.
I say this only slightly jokingly, but PowerPoint is probably the design tool I'm in most often. And people will laugh at me and say, PowerPoint, that's not a design tool. That's Microsoft Office. And I will tell you that the design tool that's used most in every company is Excel.
Yeah, that's been my experience.
People use all kinds of things, and they use what they're most familiar with rather than what's the best tool. And so, as I was saying earlier, the most important job of design is not to do visuals, it's to change minds. It's to create mental models within the minds of your stakeholders. And Excel is one way of doing that. People respect numbers, people respect spreadsheets. PowerPoint is a great way of doing that because if you create a super cool mockup and it lives in Confluence and no one sees it, or you create a Figma and no one can see it because no one spends their day in Figma, well, you're not going to change anyone's minds. If you've created something in PowerPoint, product managers live and breathe PowerPoint. They email PowerPoints to each other. They upload PowerPoints to SharePoint. They edit the PowerPoints together.
Yeah.
You go into any meeting, someone's pulled up a PowerPoint. The environment that they live in is PowerPoint. And you need to live in PowerPoint too if you want to talk to them. It's not a very good tool for creating content, but it's a great tool for sharing it. And the point of the artifacts is to spark conversation. And so you need to have the artifact live in a place that conversation can happen in. And you need to have that artifact live in a place where other people can contribute and make changes. Not necessarily the final changes. You don't want someone coming in and changing the color on your buttons or your font sizes. But if the content needs to be changed, if the prioritization or the sequencing needs to be changed, I can just have a product manager go and do that themselves in that PowerPoint they're sharing with people, rather than go back to me and say, I need these changes and tomorrow it's going to be different changes. The fact that they can change things themselves in Miro as well, to me, makes it extremely valuable, even though they don't have the title of designer, under their name on Slack.
I love that. Yeah, Miro is cool too, because you can even do like really simple prototyping in Miro. And I've actually done, back when I was working at GE, we would do, week-long workshops and stuff in these like sort of like lean events, Kaizen events and stuff like that. I don't know if you're familiar with, you've mentioned lean before, maybe you know about Kaizen events. But we would do these Kaizen events and we'd go in and I'd be able to prototype everything and mock some stuff up, really simple stuff in Miro. Awesome tool. One of my favorites as well. I really dig it. And you might appreciate this. My last boss, brilliant thing he used to do, he would keep a PowerPoint deck of just key information, priorities, where we were at, priority status updates, things like that. He would just keep them ready for when some stakeholder asked about it. And he could say, "Oh, I've got a slide deck for that." And so he would, send the slide over, and they would plug it into their PowerPoint deck, and the templates would match and everything. It'd be internal PowerPoint templates, and it would be a fit, and they'd happy, and we're happy. Everyone's happy because we had those regularly updated PowerPoint slides just ready to go. And it was just like brilliant. Just like you said, used for communicating, not for designing, but used for communicating. Brilliant way to go about it. Very wise thing.
I think that honestly connects back to this conversation in a big way, because if you share the Figma, what's going to happen is they're going to screenshot the Figma and they're going to put it in PowerPoint anyway. And then they're going to have to tell people, oh, look at this, don't look at this. And its value as a communication tool degrades immediately. Whereas if it's natively in PowerPoint and it's kind of 3 bullets or 5 bullets, you're drawing people's attention to what they should care about. And if you built that yourself, you can control that. And if you're letting your PM do that, you can't control that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I should have mentioned this before. This was something that happened to me a long time ago in my career when I first started at GE. We had this very, very, very young product manager, probably one of his first jobs out of school. And he, the senior people are very much like that dynamic, like I need to do whatever they say and I can't push back. They had this insane deadline. And I used to use Acture, and Acture was cool because, you could pull it up in a browser and you could, play around with it and actually click on buttons and interact with it as if it was a working prototype or if it was a working app. And this guy recorded himself using it in like a Loom type thing, screen grab, and then sent that out and made it seem as if we were almost done and we hadn't even started building anything yet. And so that turned into like a giant shitstorm, obviously, when people found out that we weren't even close to starting. It was just a concept. And again, I think this is one of the things, like when you have those high fidelity and you share it with people, they're going to make a certain assumptions that it's very close to being finished, and we were not. And anyway, I don't know. One anecdote maybe for everybody listening for how that can blow up in your face. But anyway, all right, Pavel, awesome, man. Well, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on. Before we get out of here, tell everybody where they can find you. Give yourself a plug.
Yeah. So, a couple of years ago, I would have said Twitter. I'm not really on Twitter anymore for reasons people should be familiar with. Most of my writing now happens on Medium. So it's spavel.medium.com. I'm also quite active on LinkedIn, which is something I thought I would never say out loud a couple of years ago. But yeah, you'll find me. I think I'm the only Pavel Samsonov who does design Pretty sure. So if you just search for my name, you'll find me. Usually I'm posting my more scattered thoughts on LinkedIn, and then when I have something more solid, I take the time to publish it on Medium. Some of my work has been syndicated to the UX Collective. Some of my work is appearing in UX Magazine. So
That's awesome.
you'll see me here and there, but if you want to get it from the source, spavel.medium.com is really where it's at.
Awesome. And we'll include all that stuff in the show notes. And if you're not following Pavel on LinkedIn, please do. You will be happy that you did. You post pretty regularly, and it's always entertaining and insightful when I read your stuff. So Pavel, thanks again for coming on, man. This is a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Well, all right, y'all, that's it for Pavel and me for today. I hope we helped to shed a little bit of light on when to use high fidelity prototypes and when you should not, when it might make more sense to use low fidelity. Remember, it's just a tool like any other tool. And now, we're not saying that visual design is not useful and visual design is bad. That is not a case at all. The question is really, when should you use high fidelity? When should you use low fidelity? And does it get you the thing that you need in that moment? Are we using the right tool for the job? That's the biggest thing to think about. But I'm curious, have you run into this? Have you found that using high fidelity versus low fidelity has worked out better or vice versa? Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would love it if you left a 5-star review. That would help me out so much more than you know. Don't forget to check out the Beyond UX Design shop. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop to pick up some of those big, beautiful UX theme art prints and digital downloads that you can print yourself. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop to get your print on. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You'll get rough transcripts and exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. You can get instant access to the video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. If you've been sitting on building your new website, Wix Studio can help get you there faster. Wix Studio is a powerful platform that lets you create and manage websites easily. With Wix Studio, you can quickly adapt designs for every device, reuse assets, and my favorite, export from Figma, and much more. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/Wix to start creating today. And if you're ready to escape the 9-to-5 and build your own business, Backlog is the community for you. Join a dedicated network sharing tactics, strategies, and systems for success. Start your journey to independence with Backlog. Don't miss out. Visit beyonduxdesign.com/backlog and join right now. Remember to sign up for the newsletter and check out all the past episodes along with all the show notes at beyonduxdesign.com. I hope you keep coming back for more great UX tips from Beyond UX Design. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX and design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all. All right, so next up, what is your... Oh my God, hold on a second, dude. I should know these questions by heart by now, but I don't have them memorized, which is bizarre because I've asked them at this point like 100 times.